So feel free, as questions come up during any of the presentations, to put them in the chat box. If you can't find the chat box, you will find it on the toolbar. Sometimes it's under More. You can open that up. You can say hello. Let us know where you're tuning in from. And the focus of this webinar is going to be about specifically the wild mushroom regulations and certification process. And we're going to be talking specifically about New York State today. Some of the principles, practices, and the certification definitely applies to other states as well. But if you're not tuning in from New York, you have to do a little bit of homework to figure out how the regulations play out potentially in your neck of the woods. So I'm going to start off. My name is Steve Gabriel. I work for the Cornell Small Farms program, where we run a specialty mushroom project. We do a number of different educational events. We work on research, learning more about production, and we focus on kind of the farm aspect of things. But in my tenure here, lots of questions about wild mushrooms, lots of questions about regulations. And so I found myself helping clarify those things and also talking to state regulators and trying to decipher what is not always the clearest of terms. So I'm going to attempt to share that with you a bit here and understand where the things stand in New York as of at least early 2021. And then I'll pass the mic to Trad Cotter, who started a certification process in South Carolina that then has spread to other parts of the country, other states. And then we'll pass it to John Michelotti, who is going to be doing some of the training in New York State coming up this year. So again, feel free, we're just going to use the chat today for questions, and we'll definitely have ample time between presentations as well as at the end if there's anything that we need to cover. All right, so with that, I will dive in, and from the Cornell Cooperative Extension, Cornell Small Farms program perspective, and on behalf of some of the regulators that I've worked with, just want to throw the fun disclaimer out. What we do, what our role in this whole process is to help clarify and spread the information. Anyone who is harvesting, growing, wild foraging mushrooms is going to be responsible for that, the safety of those mushrooms. So this is our disclaimer, just to say us and our associates are not liable for any mistakes that may be made along the way. We don't do any of the certifying, we don't do any of the vetting, we just are the conduit for information. And we provide that information to the best of our knowledge. And sometimes that's not as clear as we'd like it, but we are getting clear every day, I would say. Some follow-up resources, just so you know, this exists on the website, on our small farm program website. It's smallfarms.cornell.edu, but if you want to go directly to this page, there's a URL at the top. tinyurl.com/mushroom ID will take you to a page specifically talking about identification and sort of liability insurance, which is a related aspect to this. Our focus on identification is actually mostly around the mushrooms that we also provide support around cultivating. So we don't get into mushroom identification for the thousands of species out there you could potentially come across, but more like the shiitakes, the oysters, the lion's mane, the things that are commonly cultivated indoors and outdoors. If you want to learn to ID mushrooms, just a couple tips we'd recommend. Take a class, learn proper ID techniques before you get in. Familiarize yourself with basic characteristics of the mushrooms you're growing and or foraging. That's really important as an educator and as a marketer of those products in as much as from a regulatory standpoint. Learning potentially dangerous lookalikes would be an important part of this process. Not using Google to image and identify mushrooms, but really learning the process and getting familiar with both those mushrooms that you're interacting with and their lookalikes is really the key. And to not do this alone, not do this online only, but to really seek out folks who you can connect with and who have experience that allow you to practice your skills and develop them over time. So this is not an overnight thing. It's like learning a good language. It takes time and practice. We have a wonderful continental-wide organization, the North American Mycological Association. You can join that and then find chapters locally. And that's a great way to get out into the woods with folks, learn ID, learn the proper procedure, and hone your skills wherever you're at in the knowledge journey that is learning mushrooms. So specifically with selling wild mushrooms in New York State, what I want to highlight is another page that we have that will outline all the points I'm going to cover in this presentation. And this is found, again, you can go to Cornell Small Farms, the homepage, or that tiny URL at the top will get you right there. We'll keep this updated as we learn new things, but it does spell out all the nuances of what we're talking about here, in particular in the context of New York State. So let's get into regulations. I know this is usually not why people grow mushrooms nor wild forage, is to play around with regulations, but we want to understand them and come at them from a certain perspective. So a question I have for you to consider is the point of understanding regulations to avoid getting caught and doing something wrong, or is it about something about safety for your customers and your markets? So really recommend this resource for all things if you're involved with farm-related enterprises. Farm Commons is an organization in the Midwest that really helps in a lot of different avenues, helps you understand and navigate. One of the key things they emphasize across all their programs is that there are not, most regulatory bodies in states across the US don't have large departments of enforcement. They rely on sort of the community honor and the will to comply with a lot of the regulations. So I don't generally think that my fear is getting caught. It's really about making sure that I'm confident and that my customers and my markets are confident that I know what I'm doing. And that's really what I want to come to as a perspective in this, not so much, is someone going to bust me? The cases where we see folks getting called in is usually when there's an incident at a food service establishment where someone gets ill from a meal. Let's say they have a frittata, and in that frittata is some greens and some eggs and some mushrooms. And so usually the health department gets involved and they start to dig into the different ingredients and try to figure out who might be involved in that incident. And whether you're cultivating mushrooms or wild foraging them, if you don't have some of the sort of credentials, you don't have the traceability measures to help in that investigation, you could be liable for some of the outfall of that. So ultimately, it's really not, I think a lot of times people are afraid of the regulators, but I think it really comes down to customers and markets is ultimately who you're trying to serve. And if you want to maintain a good business, you want to maintain good relationships with them. So some definitions, we're going to talk mostly about wild harvested, but for the purposes in New York State, we define and clarify the difference between mushrooms that were intentionally cultivated and those that were wild harvested. So these are the terms that will show up in official documentation moving forward, as far as I know. So anything that clearly someone is inoculating a substrate with some kind of known strain or species, and they're creating a dedicated space, whether that's outside or indoors, that's considered intentionally cultivated. Wild harvested would be a situation where no one is inoculating anything, but they're basically found or foraged in the natural environment. Okay, so that's the major difference between those two. And you could argue there's a little room in between those two things, but I think they draw the line pretty clear about intention and dedicated space versus just finding things or searching for things. So if you're in the mushroom industry, you know that part of your work, whether you're foraging, growing, or doing some combination of the two, is going to be educating. And it's not so much, again, about the concerns about regulation, or it's not so much about are you certain or not. You may be very confident, but it's the question of who you're interacting with and how confident and how much they understand about what you're actually doing. Mushrooms remain a pretty large mystery in many circles. It's what draws people to them. It's what gives foragers and growers a good marketing tool, because curiosity tends to sell products. But in that pursuit, we run across all sorts of stories all the time in our program from folks who have to educate not just their customers, but also the regulators in their respective areas. And they just simply often don't know because they haven't come across it. They might have inspected or visited, a lettuce farm or a livestock farm, and they're familiar with that. They're just not familiar with what a mushroom farm looks like. So my experience early on was that we had a hard time getting insurance for our cultivated mushroom system. And that was mostly because the insurers had never seen a mushroom farm and were imagining essentially a scenario where we were looking for mushrooms in the woods, or we were sort of haphazardly planting them and then discovering them sometime later. And the first time they came out and actually visited, they saw our setup. They saw that it was very intentional, deliberate, very clear what was intentionally cultivated versus what you might find in the woods. Their entire tune really changed. So just keep in mind that no matter where you get involved with, your mushroom journey is probably going to be steeped in education, and don't expect that regulators or insurance folks or customers are going to know what you're talking about. So it's really important to educate and assure folks of what you're getting into. So with mushroom species, of course, we have lots of different categories. So we have those two categories, but the problem sometimes, or the challenge, is that sometimes there's species that we're really only intentionally cultivating versus others that we're really only wild harvesting. And then we have kind of those overlap species where we can both cultivate them and wild harvest them. And that also leads to some of the confusion when I talk to regulators and other folks who are trying to understand what's going on in the situation. So in New York State, the only written law is this one, essentially saying that mushroom species that are picked in the wild shall be obtained from sources where each mushroom is individually inspected and found to be safe by an approved mushroom identification expert prior to sale. And it used to say underneath, at this time, there are no approved mushroom experts. So for many years, it was kind of the state had punted. They weren't interested in trying to describe or determine who is approved and who is not. And that is still true. These regulatory agencies are not interested in determining who is a quote unquote approved expert. So there was no mechanism in place to help define that. And the state had no interest in doing it themselves, as they shouldn't. That's not really their wheelhouse. But that's the way the regulation read, and it's not going to change. That's something we're going to have to work with moving forward. In New York State in particular, there's some complication because our jurisdiction in particular results in sort of a duality of who is regulating where different products end up going in the food service world. So if it's a direct retail sale venue, then Department of Ag and Markets is going to be the regulatory agency in that context. Generally, then other food vendors such as restaurants, grocery markets, these are usually called food service establishments or FSEs, as people write these things out. Those are going to be regulated by the New York State Health Department. New York State Health Department has both a statewide entity and then single county offices. New York State Ag and Markets basically has a centralized area and then regions or districts. And so you think about also how information is shared. So I talk to people mostly on the state level. That does not mean that everybody at the local level or the regional level knows what the regulations are, how they're changing over time. So you may have to, again, educate your local health department about what kind of regulations are present. And it's better to reach out ahead of time than to start selling and then have a problem when there's a question arisen because someone isn't familiar with those things. So hopefully our resources and this information can help you in that process to sort of get out ahead of any potential issues. So again, neither of these entities are interested in licensing or certifying or approving anyone. They're saying basically that some existing recognized expert is going to be required to approve each individual person as being their own approved mushroom identification expert. I literally took these words from correspondence. They read a lot like regulations do. If a forager is able to access training that certifies them to forage for wild mushrooms by specific variety, then in this case, NISDAM said they would consider that documentation. All right, and at this time, the Mushroom Mountain certification, which we'll talk about next, is the only approved class to achieve this purpose. So essentially, they're considering the folks that teach the Mushroom Mountain course as recognized experts, and they are training, certifying, and maintaining a database of approved experts in their own right, to do this work. So that's kind of how they see it. I appreciate the clarity, even if the sentences are kind of long and run on at the end of the day. All right. Let me know if there's any questions about that, but that's basically how it breaks down. A caveat to this is a couple things. So right now, essentially NISDAM, so direct retail sales are considered fine if you're a certified approved expert and you've gone through the process, then you could sell to direct retail markets anytime. Unfortunately, at this point, New York State Health Department recently did a revision of its food code, which essentially spells these things out that I'm talking about. It also lists the species, which I believe John is going to share later, that are approved through the certification process for you to forage and sell. And the key thing there, those are species that are you're trained in and you're tested on, and then also are considered having some economic value that would be worth foraging for sale. Right now, though, those draft food code standards are sort of tucked away in a file cabinet because they were in the process of drafting them, and they were overhauling the entire food code. And then that entire food code was going to go up for public comment, and then it was going to be certified, and then basically it would be written into the approved process. And as we're all familiar, guess what happened? COVID happened. And so that entire process has now been on delay, and I don't have any certain timeline of when it's going to be re-engaged. So at some point there will be a public comment on the published food code, how they've written it, and the species they have, and all that kind of good stuff. And everyone has a chance to comment on that, and then they'll approve it. And so technically until then, New York State, the health department does not consider it okay to sell to food service establishments until that time. So that's the information. You can take it and run with it as you will. This is a quick schematic from some resources on our website. I'm not going to get into all the details here. What I want to point out is we have two types of mushrooms here at the top. Again, the intentionally cultivated, and we have the wild harvested. I want to point out that within fresh mushroom sales, it's funny because we just talked about this whole complex process for wild harvested. You have to be inspected by an approved expert in order to sell, right? Which you can become if you do the certification, you pass the test. For intentionally cultivated mushrooms, there's actually no special permits or licenses to sell fresh mushrooms in the state. That's really common with most produce. That's the way it works. You can start to grow mushrooms that you know are of a known species, intentionally cultivated, and start selling them out your back door if you want. Other things start to kick in though, and that's what I want to point out is that certain scales of intentional cultivation, you start to talk about produce safety rules, all right? And you should read up on that if you're not familiar with when those might kick in. That's called the Food Safety Modernization Act, and we have resources on our website to talk more about that. And then no matter if they're intentionally cultivated or if they're wild harvested, in New York State, once you get into any sort of dried, value-added, or medicinal product, then other regulatory aspects start to kick in. So for dried mushrooms as well as value-added products in the state of New York, you will need to follow what is called a 20C licensing process for processing those in what's called sometimes a certified kitchen. We're actually going to be publishing this year a process for dried mushrooms that adheres to the standards that the state feels is safe. For any value-added foods, you'd have to submit the recipe to the Cornell Food Venture Center and get that approved prior to processing in a 20C kitchen. There's a guide on our website called The Guide to Farming in New York State. You can download that and learn about what it means to be a 20C and all the kind of fun caveats to that part of it. So that's all regulated by Ag and Markets. Excuse me, if it's I should say a product that is going to be consumed as a food. If you're going into the medicinal realm, then we start to usually get into a case where we're using fresh or dried mushrooms and then we're turning into medicinal products, and that becomes the wheelhouse of the FDA. So just keep that all in mind, this wonderful chart here, that we have lots of things to consider. What we're mostly focused on is the sale of fresh mushrooms at this point. All right, and then lastly, overarching all this, no matter what you're involved with, you probably want to think about private liability insurance to cover your yourself in any kind of instance that might need to be covered. Okay, so if we're talking about certification, the way the state is seeing this, and this is mirrored in, I'm sure what will be talked about in the next series of presentations, we have the attendance of a certification course and passing an exam, showing that you're confident and able to identify. And again, it's by an approved firm, and the only approved firm at this point is the Mushroom Mountain certification. After that process, anytime you're doing a sale, you're going to engage in good record keeping and traceability. What they're looking for is specifically the date collected, the species, and the city and location. And then you're going to want to properly label all your mushrooms with traceability info, which Mushroom Mountain has their own standard for, which we sort of brought into the process to understand. And it looks kind of like this. Talked about keeping this record journal, something like that, and then properly labeling anything that you're taking out to a market with your contact information, the name of the mushroom, the weight, the recommended storage temperature, and then a tracing number where you have a permit number and then you have the date that it was collected. And so that should help in any instances. The folks should be able to keep that back. And I believe the health department is asking food service establishments to keep those records for something like 30 or 60 days after the sale, just in case there's a need to go back and do that traceability. Okay. So those are kind of some basic things. This is a great idea also, by the way, if you're doing intentionally cultivated. You should have a traceability system. On our farm, we basically use this exact same system for all of our sold mushrooms in order to have the same kind of accountability. If you get into the produce safety thresholds, you have to actually have those traceability guidelines. So it's good practice, even if you're at a small scale, to have that kind of stuff in place. So basically, to summarize, intentionally cultivated mushrooms, one of the things is that if you're inoculating something with a known mushroom and a known substrate, it's pretty unlikely you're going to have something else show up that might be a dangerous lookalike. But it's important to know how to properly identify mushrooms and to be able to instill confidence, as I've said, in your customers, markets, insurance, and your regulators. And you'll probably have to educate all those folks at some point. And we recommend that you maintain records for traceability. You're only required to do that if you meet certain sales thresholds that would kick in the produce safety rule through FSMA. For wild harvested, you do have to have a certification, have that documentation, and then maintain records for traceability. All right, so that's the simple short end of the stick. And what we're going to do is see if there's any questions about those things. And then we will talk about this certification process that the lovely folks at Mushroom Mountain have laid out for us, which really helps us move this along much quicker than we ever could have imagined. So I'll pause there. And I'm going to stop sharing. Any questions on that piece of things? And Trad, if you want to queue up.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and queue up as questions are trickling in. They are. Let's see. If you can give me access to screen sharing, I'd do it.
Okay, I guess so. Here we go. All right. I'm just going to make you a co-host, which should give you that privilege.
I can shoot the ball back if I need to.
So the only question I see, I'll take that as a compliment if there's not a ton of questions, because hopefully that laid it out pretty clearly. Michael's asking about a blurred line: wild harvesting tissue cultures to later be intentionally cultivated. So there's no regulations covering your harvest of wild tissue cultures. If you're intentionally cultivating them later, they would fall into the intentionally cultivated category, and so you're back in that wheelhouse, which is good.
Can you see that slide?
Yes, sir. And then Ron's asking if there's documentation that lists the record keeping requirements. Not able to get a screenshot. Yes, so I will put the link again in the chat to go right to that page that is a summary of all the regulations, and you'll find the documentation there about record keeping. All right, Chad, I think you can get rolling.
Yeah, man, I'll take it away. All right, thanks, Steve. And yeah, good overview. And also, some of these slides are going to be redundant. And my name's Chad Cotter. I'm with Mushroom Mountain. I'm one of the designers of the mushroom certification course. And I just want to say I was drawn into this arena because South Carolina was mushrooms were illegal to sell, and then once we started putting these slides together, and the attorneys got together with the state and the Department of Health, we became one of the first states that had a certification program that covered so many different species. And about 2 courses in, we were covertly audited by the FDA, and they had high praises to our course and recommended us to Georgia and North Carolina shortly after. And then I was invited to speak at the FDA, the Food Safety Summit down in Biloxi, and then from that summit at the National Environmental Health Association conference up in Michigan. And I'll talk a little bit more about that stuff. But anyway, I believe it's a great course. And I'm just going to give you some quick overview. We all know this, every mushroom's edible, and for 30 minutes. And one of the big takeaways from my course is that the foragers have a huge responsibility to the health of those that are consuming. Once the mushroom gets into commerce, it's a big deal. So we don't take it very lightly at all. A lot of people, I would say over half of who takes our course are folks who want to learn mushroom identification for themselves. And they say, well, we're not interested in selling them. We just want to know, but they are still tested the same as anybody that's going to sell. Okay. So it's like Steve said, it's like an immersion, like learning a foreign language. And we cover a lot of ID. We don't just show how to identify the mushroom species on the list. This is a how to identify mushrooms course that is also partnered with food safety, handling, and I've been through enough states, health departments, where I've gotten feedback, and we've built upon the course. It's in its 7th year, I believe, and we've got some really good feedback and criticism from other health departments as to how to make it better. So we've built and taken the advice of other health departments and made it that much stronger. Just know that there's thousands of mushroom species out there. There's thousands. So how do we, tease those apart? How do you create a mushroom expert in 2 days? I mean, that term, I would dare say, almost need to be absolved. Now, can you teach how to identify 30, 40, 50 mushrooms competently in 2 days? Absolutely. And, it's engineered to do that. Steve talked about what's cultivated and what's not. Right now, most, if not all, the mycorrhizal fungi are considered not cultivated, which would be, chanterelles. Morels is a loose subject. They could be, different habitats at different time. And, porcini, there's boletes, there's black trumpets. There's a long list of the species on the list that are mycorrhizal. They cannot be cultivated unless you plant the trees or plant the plants. Okay. How do we choose the species? Now that, we're just the teaching and testing entity in all of this. And we can help with the state's decision on this, take public comment, as Steve described. What I look for is the economic value of the mushrooms, and also whether they're abundant or scarce, but also the likelihood of confusion. So there's a lot of good edible mushrooms that are fruiting out there that are really hard to ID. So obviously we're not going to put those into a 2-day course for our personal liability for any particular state. That's not to say that it can't be on a list like New York or any other state listed if somebody wants to forage themselves and sell it. But we're not going to. We're trying to protect not just us, but the consumers ultimately. Chanterelles, morels, many of those are the most abundant and economic worthy mushrooms to be harvesting. And what we'll do is we'll cover all the likelihood of confusion species, lookalikes and dissections, gill attachments, spore prints. The participants have to know all this. It's not just looking at a picture and regurgitating an answer. In other words, it's a whole process of identification during the 2 days that they have to utilize during their final exam. The purpose is because of the increase in exposures, because there's an increase in the interest and the actual process. People are going out, they're seeing, money, they're seeing opportunity in the forest, either for themselves, to feed their families, or to sell and to put into commerce. So there's no traceability or liability. Now, these are in states that don't have a program, no training or certification. expected in most states, and you need to provide a safety check in this food system. All right. So when you look at no formal program, you look at maybe an unskilled or beginning forager, and no buyer awareness, which is a safety check. In other words, I know what a chanterelle and a morel look like, and if I was buying from a market, I would be the third check in that, you know. But a lot of people buying at the grocery store, or even chefs, many chefs don't have the formal skills to identify mushrooms that are in a box that could be mixed up. So ultimately, it goes back to this program, right? And when you have all these overlap, then you have positive cases. So how do we remove that? So what we're looking at is our program, which is a 2-day class, and we cover the process of identification, gill attachments, pore attachments. We cover different boletes, even things that are not even on the exam, because it's about identifying mushrooms. All right. And once they get to the final exam, there's absolutely zero chance of guessing on these. There's no true or false or multiple choice questions on here without an explanation. All right. And I'm going to give you one example that separates our course from others. And this isn't a sales pitch. This is a fact that Michigan was teaching a course. There's one of the universities there. They had a 100% multiple choice question exam, and an 80%, if you get 80% or above, you pass. You get a mushroom certification. That is not true here. You have to show complete and exhibit complete competence and fluency in species recognition. All these are hand graded. There's no guessing. There's absolutely no guessing this. And also, if there are questions, if there are red flags, that every single participant is called in for an oral exam. You know, they have to set it up and they have to nail it. All right. Now, obviously, it's difficult to do. We've done these online for the past year. We've done them in person. What's the difference? Honestly, I could say that the online class is harder and more complete. The only thing we did in the wild was actually just go out and collect a few mushrooms and show people how to pick them. But ultimately, the 2-day course is just really full of really good identification information. So we use a lot of visual slides. We use taxonomy, and we use memorization traits and things like that. And Steve, I'm not watching the chat board. If something big comes up, you may want to just interrupt me. Okay. I'm just blasting through it.
Yep.
All right. All right. Yep. All right.
There's
so
a question. Sorry, there is a question. Are you testing for scientific names?
No, there's really no need. I mean, why bog down the bandwidth of the important information, which is actually the physical nature of what is this mushroom? Okay. Yeah, no spelling unless it's completely the opposite of what it should be, right? Scientific names are not tested. Common names, fine, but you will need to know the scientific names for packaging and things like that. Okay. 2-day intensive course, you get the materials provided a month before. That's given if you sign up a month before, up to the day before, even the day before. It's designed for absolute beginners. Now, there could be a lot of people listening that say, well, I've been hunting mushrooms for most of my life, and how can an absolute beginner be able to identify all these mushrooms? Well, they do. They only, for the testing, it's poisonous, deadly, common poisonous, deadly species, toxicity, degrees of onset. I'll show you that in a minute. But also the species and their lookalikes that are being tested, right? We're not testing for hundreds of species here. All right, and then there's a final exam. Also in the exam are, what's allowed, and this could be taught state by state, and I let the certifiers who teach the course along with me kind of give like where do people hunt, where are you allowed to hunt, the common poisonous deadly mushrooms in your region, toxicology, symptoms, onset, I spelled symptoms wrong, and treatments. That's very important, not just to know the mushrooms that are edible and good, but also the other side of the coin. So we spend a lot of time on toxicology and all the poisonous mushrooms in the region. Storage recommendations. That was a recommendation by the state of South Carolina and Georgia. So they wanted to see more time spent on, listen, you could take a perfectly good edible mushroom and make it dangerous, just like you could meat or another product. It's the way that it's stored. There's the bacteria, spoilage, things like that. So we spend time on storage recommendations, consumer risk, cooking all the mushrooms, and then the tracking codes and harvesting records, which is the most important, is identifying, being able to label and track that package, whether it's a bag at the market or a box at a restaurant that is serving wild mushrooms, to be able to trace back who sold it, what batch did it come out of, and be able to go back to their original journal to figure out what it might be. And then we're talking about degree of onset, meaning how long did it take for that person to get sick? Luckily, I would tell you, anyone who's listening, we haven't had one single case in almost 7 years of any kind of reaction to a mushroom by anyone who's been through our program. Steve showed this earlier, so I can zoom through this. We require everyone just to keep a journal, and this also doubles as a nice journal, like a diary or calendar, to help you go back and find mushrooms, where they were. I'll never really ask to see this. Again, if there's an issue, we are the certifying agency. So if something happens, I'm listed with NAMA for toxicology. You can call me, and I take pet calls, I take human calls, and I would ask any certifying agent to look at the that journal entry to see, like this, like the date, species, and where. And there's the permit number. Like if my permit number was 1 or 89, you see, we could quickly find out who that person was, contact them, and then we would give them this reference number and say, this is what did you collect? Did you have any pictures, or what time of the year? And then we try to figure out what potential treatment is for that person. But again, luckily we have not had to do it, but it is in place. Mushrooms are alive, they're aerobic, and they need a lot of oxygen when they are fresh, even under refrigeration, otherwise they'll spoil. Dried mushrooms are still alive up to a year, but they're fine with no oxygen. We want to avoid plastic unless they're vented. So we actually not only teach people in this class how to identify mushrooms, but how to collect them and how to be ethical in the woods as well. Not marking territories, not cutting through brush, doing things like that. So John Michelotti is going to follow up on this, on some of the New York regulations. Again, most of them have followed our guidelines, but there are some subtle differences between each state. All right. I'll tell you just by 2 examples. Georgia, they have to retain the tracking codes for 90 days if you're a restaurant or caterer. North Carolina, you have to fill an extra verification form, and again, retain the tag. They have special tags that go on the boxes and things like that. All right. So just, again, this certification covers many, many different states that they keep adding on, but it's up to the forager to know the individual laws. And we try to help with, by putting these regulations up on our website as well. To give you an example of some of the slides that we use, for some exams, we do left and rights, we do dissections, there's color reactions. These are morels and false morels. We also do some trick slides. I'm a very tricky person. Steve knows me pretty well. And honey mushrooms versus sulfur tufts. And, without the spore print, you wouldn't be able to, a beginner would not be able to discern the two. So, but given this slide and these 2 spore prints, anyone who's been through my 2-day course or our 2-day course should be able to make a positive ID on these mushrooms. We also look at young versus old, and not many people do. And so this is a bluet, a young bluet, and a young Cornarius, and they can look very similar in appearance. This is much more purple at times, but until you turn them up, you can see like there's like maybe there might be one thing off, one difference here, and that's what we're training in our course, is to really develop that, not creating a mushroom expert, but is to create a pattern of expertise. In other words, a system of identifying mushrooms. Yes, mushrooms can kill you. What are you going to do? It is 100% preventable, and it's the sole responsibility of the picker. Now, saying that, the permit does not allow anyone to purchase or accept mushrooms from other foragers who are not permitted, who are not trained. That being is that we are preventing what's called commingling of mushrooms, meaning someone can just go out and pick everything, throw them in a basket, bring them to a permitted holder, and then they're just going to sort through them. Well, they've touched, and pieces of who knows, deadly gallerinas or destroying angels have commingled with, say, a chanterelle or something like that. That's just unacceptable. And what that also does is prevent a company from coming in, buying one permit, and then employing a bunch of unskilled foragers or laborers to just go out and rake the woods clean of mushrooms without any ethics at all. Above and beyond the course, we teach several segments called, 6 or 7 circular objects. A lot of people who are new to mushroom hunting might say, oh, that looks like a truffle, or it looks like a puffball. Again, after 2 days in the course, you have no doubt that this is something that you should not be using. And even food writers from New York, I have to say, Steve, came down to Georgia and misidentified these as pecan truffles under the pecan trees, and sliced them, put them over top of pasta, and said that they tasted awful. And then later had to issue a statement that they were poisonous earth balls. Right. And we do cover the deadliest of the deadly, because it's important to try to keep people. Ultimately, the role of the course is, yes, it's for a certification so you can sell, but ultimately the goal is to keep people safe. It's a food safety course that is labeled mushroom identification certification for us. After a few days of these slides and picking these features apart from these different mushrooms, there should be no way that anyone passing that exam should be able to make a mistake. Destroying angels, degree of onset, everything's taught, so anyone can react to a potential poisoning case just in case a horrific mistake was made. And I know that Steve put this up there. I'm a member of NAMA, North American Mycological Association. While we are giving the class, we actually pull up the poisoning files and look down through the toxicology reports, so I can show attendees who are potential, certification recipients that, what are people typically getting confused out there that are either beginners or experienced mushroom hunters. And a lot of them are beginners. There's a lot of pet poisoning, but we also cover these resources as well. So I love looking back to these poisoning cases to see what is being reported. And a lot of them are mushrooms that may have interactions with alcohol. They may have interactions with, generally alcohol and stuff like that, or undercooked. That's what it was, undercooked. Steve covered this. They very clearly distinguish between wild and foraged, wild cultivated and wild foraged. And that question came up: can I forage? Can I get some wild mycelium out of the garden or the woods, and then clone it, cultivate it, and then those are now cultivated mushrooms for sure. All right, so I could skip over this. After the 2-day course, if you pass your exam with flying colors, I literally have a 0 tolerance policy on any wrong answers. It's a long exam. I will tell you that the in-person exam took about 2 to 3 hours. I've heard that the online exam is much more intense. It could take 5 hours or longer. All right, so it's very intense. So I'm actually liking the online course, but it's going to be the same intensity for in person. You get a paper, like a PDF permit. We've changed that to certification. It's not a permit to do anything. It'll have a list of the species that we have tested for. This is not the list of species for every state. So it's well above and beyond the species that are listed in any particular state, for instance. So that being said, there's a lot of incredible, wonderful mushrooms out there. And my role and our role at Mushroom Mountain is to keep people safe. In the mail later, you'll receive a mushroom ID card. We've foregone the list on the back because we started this back with one state. Now it's all changed. So we have a little link that you can go to and check what is allowable by each state. And that's where you can reach us, Mushroom Mountain. You can reach me at myceliumtrad@gmail.com. And I'll just leave it right there. Steve?
Thanks. A couple of questions. And feel free, folks, to put more questions in the chat if you have anything coming up. Do you teach sustainability, like over harvesting or anything like that in the course?
Well, I do have studies that, yeah, ethics is part of it. Trying to leave younger species or older species that are sporulating, like different stages of development. Also with chaga, I have a hard time with people over collecting chaga in a particular way, harvesting the whole sclerotia off the tree, things like that. Now, there has been studies that shown that if you are picking mushrooms in a particular area, like chanterelles, there's been some chanterelle studies where you pick the fruiting bodies, and the more you pick, the more they actually produced, because mushroom spores actually trigger once they sporulate back onto the ground and wiggle their way into the soil and touch the mycelium, the same mycelium from which they fruited from, they actually reduce the yields. So picking, not so much, but more the ethics is, some of the conchs and things like that, which aren't on the certification at all.
And then a kind of a couple combo question here, like is this class accepted in Massachusetts or any other New England states? And it was mentioned it's expanding, like what's the status on this, or how would you recommend if people are in other states, they go about seeing if this could be applied to their state?
Yeah, the only thing that's preventing it from going state to state is just me contacting the health department, or they're having interest. And like Steve said, it's like every state is different. South Carolina has DHEC, Department of Health and Environmental Control, and then they oversee everything about mushrooms. I go to Georgia, it's the Department of Agriculture and the Health Department, split between markets and restaurants. In other words, fresh, farmers markets, restaurants and caterers. Now that completely, and they don't even discuss the nature of anything between the two of them, which is hard. So I would just need to know if you're interested in your particular state, and you might know of who regulates that takes a little bit of time, then I can send them a proposal or a package that covers, basically it's what this program is, get them on a few calls and get them comfortable with what we're doing and show them what we've done with other states. And typically after, I don't know, 6-7 states now, that it's been a fairly easy process. I know Alabama's getting ready to hopefully sign on soon, in Colorado. So.
All right, a couple more. Maybe you can stop sharing and I'll let John queue up his slides while we're answering a few more questions. Explain how dry mushrooms are alive for a year.
Oh, did I get out of that?
Yeah.
Okay. How are they alive? Well, the mycelium just goes dormant. So I've tissue cultured and cloned mushrooms long enough to find out that if you dry them, now here's the thing: if you dry them below 105 degrees or 100 degrees, then it doesn't cook the mycelium. Mycelium has the basically a mushroom is mycelium. So if you can dry it at a very low temperature and store it at room temperature or even in the fridge, you can crack it open and that mycelium will come right back to life in the lab. And it really depends on the species. I've had them go up to a year, and that's actually my preferred way of cloning mushrooms is to dry them first because there's less bacteria to deal with, and it's a very easy storage method. Yeah, they just go dormant, dehydrated.
Alrighty, great. Thanks, Chad.
Yeah.
We're going to pass the mic to Mr. John Michelotti to share a bit. John's one of the instructors based in New York, and he'll be helping with the certification. So take it away, John.
Great, thanks, Steve, and thanks, Strad, for putting this together. This is really fantastic to be a part of it. And everybody can see my screen all right, I'm assuming?
Yeah, it looks great.
Great. Okay, so yeah, both Steve and Trad have done just exceptional work in putting this together and getting this passed in New York State, and we're fortunate to be able to put this together with them and work with them to have a food safety certification course, which is near and dear to me, as I'll go into it. So overview over just the next half hour. I'm just going to introduce myself, my company, the class plans of basic layout, and then notable edible species to be covered in the course with a specific focus on New York State. So I got into mushrooms through Gary Linkoff, who is my main mentor, taught at the New York Botanical Gardens for 42 years and was just an excellent person. And my first introduction was by joining a mushroom club, which is something that Steve and Trad talked about, but it's really a great way to network with people and to have people to bounce ideas off of and learn from and to get out in the woods with. They're generally like-minded people. And it was years later that I founded Catskill Fungi, which was based out of need for the community for mushroom knowledge. There was not a lot of people that knew about mushrooms or were making and supplying local mushroom extracts. And so that was where we branched off there. I became a president of one of these local mushroom clubs, the Mid-Hudson Mycological Association, and then most recently was awarded a steward of the Catskills by the Catskill Center for work in the environment, preserving the Catskills and the heritage there. Yeah, per Trad's recommendation, I also became a poison control identification consultant through the North American Mycological Association, and I am certified wild mushroom forager 848. And yeah, I think I did the online course last June, and yeah, I believe the exam took about 4 hours. I think I was putting Latin names down. So Catskill, a bit about my company, Catskill Fungi, is we focus mostly on education and medicinal mushrooms. So we do a variety of different identification walks that not only focus on edible and poisonous species, but also on historic values, medicinal purposes, and current scientific trends and things like this. We host cultivation workshops, mostly low tech, but indoor and outdoor, and we have weekend-long retreats where we teach about all these things as well as how to make medicinal mushroom extracts. And that's the other passion for Catskill Fungi is we make triple extracted mushroom tinctures from wild mushrooms. We forage in the Catskills as well as grow on our family farm and support other local mushroom farms with. And this is the Catskill Mountains. This is like my this is my home right here, my family farm that my great-great-grandfather bought in the late 1800s. And my cousin lives over here, my other cousin lives over there, and I started Catskill Fungi in this little cabin here. And we're hoping to, we host some inoculation workshops over there. And from the looks of it, you can probably tell there's mushrooms everywhere around here. These are some of the medicinal mushroom extracts I make. And another thing, just as an overview of why I approached trad to teach this class, was through teaching a variety of different other classes, I had chefs break down crying because they bought mushrooms from somebody and ended up poisoning the kitchen staff. They were basically poisonous boletes and everybody was puking. Fortunately, it wasn't anything more deadly than that. And then on the other side, I've taught classes where people have, you know, gotten into mushrooms and they said, oh yeah, I just found these mushrooms and I sold them to this this grocery store. They said, great, you know, what did you do to double check them? And they said, well, nothing. And I said, what did you do to identify them? And they had like a little fold out pamphlet. And so, you know, it's really for the health and safety of the people in the area and the restaurants and things like this as the market grows. So as far as the class plan goes, which was, you know, very well covered by trad, you know, there is an introduction where we all get to share why we're there and what we're doing. And even online, it was very interesting to see where everybody was calling in from and what their purpose of being there was. There is an overview of the class where we talk about, you know, what's going to be covered. We go over the guidelines and, you know, the safety guidelines and how to package mushrooms that you find and make notes and journal, as well as tools and techniques of how to forage mushrooms and also principles of sustainability, as Trad mentioned before. There is an extensive poisonous ID talk, as Trad mentioned before, and you know, you end up realizing just based on characteristics of features pretty quickly which mushrooms are poisonous. And this was that poison pigskin puffball that Trad had in there, but this is actually an edible bolete that grows parasitically. It's Boletus parasiticus on that poison pigskin puffball. Now, despite the fact that this mushroom is edible, is not available for certified foragers to sell because it is not on the list. So these are all things to keep in mind as you go. But the species profiles are laid out very well, as Trad exemplified in his slideshow, and things are really peeled through. The characteristics, especially the important characteristics of each edible mushroom and how to tell it apart from the lookalikes, are gone over again and again. It's really something that, as Trad said, even as a beginner, you can really take this course and be comfortable and confident identifying edible mushrooms and either selling them or, you know, enjoying them with your friends and family. And, you know, just these side-by-side pictures that Trad had on his slideshow are very similar, where, you know, you can see the picture of the mushrooms like these chanterelles, and then close up, you know, some of these main difference between chanterelles and your jack-o'-lantern mushrooms is that, you know, your chanterelles have these forked gills that are branching off and kind of come down to one, that are actually ridges. They're kind of false gills that ridge up, whereas your jack-o'-lantern mushroom have deep bladed gills that rarely fork. So these key features are covered within all these mushrooms. And like I said, there's a lot of redundancy where you learn this, you're sure about it. And, you know, when you're tested on it, you really know your stuff, as well as knowing the lookalikes. So other things that we might do is do virtual walks where we'll, you know, if we're doing this online, we'll be outdoors, you know, Trad will be out there, or one of the online teachers will be out there, myself, and then we are walking through, showing how to harvest mushrooms, showing how to pick these, how to really have sustainable impacts on the land, and leave no trace principles could be tied in there. Also, there are some chances to use keys, keying out mushrooms through Mushroom Expert, or highlighting different specific groups like boletes and Lactarius, and different resources that you can utilize to double check your mushrooms. As I mentioned, there's a lot of review, and there's plenty of time for questions and answers, plenty of time for people to talk about different things, ask questions. And it was doing this online with Trad, it was really more like hanging out on the weekend, looking at mushrooms, enjoying the things we like, and making jokes and having fun. It's really a lot of fun, despite the fact that it's 2 long days of mushrooms. The course plan and the way it's put together by Mushroom Mountain really makes it not only palatable, but a lot of fun. So, specific mushrooms in New York, and there's quite a bit on the list, as we'll see. But here's a few. And if you'd like, you can type in the chat box how many of these mushrooms you know already. And that'll just be kind of like a fun game. But there's certain things that you're focused on when you're looking at mushrooms. You know, what is it growing out of? How is it attached to what it's growing out of? You know, what is your spore bearing surface, or your fertile surface? What is making the spores on these mushrooms, as well as spore color and things like this. So yeah, so as you can see, there's a variety of different mushrooms out there, from reishi, which is more of a medicinal mushroom that's utilized for drying in teas and things like this, but can be edible, especially on the margin, the outside edge, but not very delicious. There's a variety of different hericium that are covered. Once again, you don't need to know the Latin names. Your lion's mane, your hericium, your comb tooth, your bear's head. There's about 3 different main varieties within the Northeast, but many of which have the same characteristics. You also have some mushrooms that appear in the fall, some are in different seasons. And this is another thing to note. You know, if you're finding something that looks like maitake or hen of the woods that people might mistake as that in July or June, it's probably not maitake or hen of the woods. It's probably Bondarziewia berkeleyi, or the Berkeley's polypore, or the black staining polypore, and things like this. These are all covered in this course. You get the side-by-side photos. You get to see which is the edible and which is the lookalike, and what the differences are. And then you have things like lobster mushrooms, hypomycetes, lactiflorum, and how to identify those. So these are common. These are very common in New York State that we're finding all around the Catskills and in different areas. You have a variety of different shapes, sizes, colors, textures out there that are all covered. And once again, it's broken down very methodically in a way that's very palatable. You know, where's a fertile surface on each one of these? You know, you have some like puffballs that make them inside. You have some that make it on the teeth, some that make it, you know, within inside these little dark hollows of this mushroom here, that if you know the name of, feel free to type it out in the chat box. And you know, along the outside edge here. And so, all right, I'm gonna spoil a surprise if anybody knows which ones these are. But yes, a variety of puffballs are covered, not just these little ones, but the giant puffballs are covered as well. We also have a variety of the hedgehog or sweet tooth hydnums or pandums, as well as these delicious, delectable morels. And one other thing that Trad talked about, and this goes for like chicken mushrooms and morels, that he mentioned in his talk, was cooking thoroughly, because there have been poison reports of people that get sick eating morels, that that really go downhill because they didn't cook it thoroughly. And morels, when not cooked thoroughly, causes projectile vomiting, which is not as fun as it sounds. Then your black trumpets, your craterellus, of which there's two different species here, but are all covered within the list. And as far as this list goes, these are the mushrooms that you're going to learn how to identify by the end of this course. It's pretty extensive and quite fun. Now, we've gone over this list, and now some of these green highlighted mushrooms, as you can say, are the New York State relevant mushrooms. These are the ones that we have in this, that are prolific, I should say. The blue chanterelle polycilus multiplex is around, but it actually may make the list of Northeast Rare 10 mushrooms, which is being compiled right now. Candy caps, I guess there's a couple different species, but they are also not very common. And then your hawkswing Sarcodon imbricatus is unpalatable. It is quite bitter up here, but many of these other mushrooms are covered. Now, presently, as Steve was talking about, the New York State Department of Health is looking to approve this wild mushroom list, and these are the black bolded ones. Now, after that list goes through the first round of approval, it goes to public comment, and other mushrooms can be added. So we're hoping to add some of the rest of these, and potentially some other ones potentially. So we will see. But this is your main list. Feel free. And this is also talked about on the Mushroom Mountain website that you can go to sign up for the courses. It talks about each one of these mushrooms and the like. So once again, thanks so much, Steve Gabriel, for talking with these health departments and making this happen and viable and safe within our communities, and Trad Cotter and Mushroom Mountain, Olga Cotter, for putting this amazing program together. And yes, if you all want to contact me, you can check out my website, catskillfungi.com. You can reach me at john@catskillfungi.com and the like. So yeah, thanks so much again for having me. And we'll see. Are there any questions there?
Yeah, there was one. This is Trad. Different mushrooms, like chicken of the woods, or mushrooms that grow on different substrates. Their edibility based on their substrates. You have any comment on that?
Yeah, there are some, like chicken mushrooms specifically, where growing on conifer can cause gastric upset. And it's one thing that I believe during the class Trad talked about. He always recommends, and this is something that you can put on the packaging if you're going to sell these mushrooms to restaurants. He always recommends to boil it, to double boil it first throughout the water before sauteing. This helps to draw those toxins out.